welcome to Eco Show. I'm Henry, and this is a weekly show with your roundup of ecology and environmentally related information from the past week. We start out with a animal, insect, or thing of the week, and then talk about some recent research, and then get into the news. So this week, our animal of the week is the Canada goose. This is one of my favorite animals when I was a little kid after I saw the movie Winged Migration. I really liked the goose after seeing that. And the Canada goose, its Latin name is Branta canadensis. It's my Latin accent. And Branta means a goose with black plumage. Comes from the Old Norse word brangos, which means burnt goose. That burnt for being black. And some information around geese, about these Canada goose, is that they are monogamous. They find a mate in the second year of life, and they live for usually about 10 to 24 years. They've been transported all around the world. They're originally from, as the name suggests, North America, where they migrate from Canada down to lower parts of North America, as far down as Mexico. But they've been transported to other places around the world like the UK, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, New Zealand, Japan, Chile, and Argentina. They've been transported and put into these different places, and as we'll talk about in a moment, in those places they are considered to be invasive. These birds are herbivorous, but they will eat some sort of insects, and they'll eat often around lakes and ponds that they're living in. And they've done very well in human environments, which is why, to some extent, they're seen as a pest now. So there are many years in North America where their habitat was under threat, and subspecies of the Canada goose got to very small, low populations. But they've been recovering pretty well. And the issue with these is that they will poop, which is good in some ways because it spreads nutrients, but a lot of times the nitrogen and phosphorus from their poop will be in the ponds or lakes where they're at and will lead to eutrophication, which is where you get all of these extra nutrients from the poop, enriching different things growing in there, different algae and things like that, that take oxygen out of the water and make it toxic for animals. And this can be bad in places where they've been transported to, because Canada geese have learned to live in particular areas and not migrate as much. So in some places they've been transported to, they won't really migrate, and they'll kind of hang out at the same place. So that's a lot of nutrients going into that space where they're at. They also will eat crops. Some people are annoyed by their noise. They have aggressive behavior, which is pretty impressive because they usually are migrating these huge distances, and they are able to scare off coyotes and wolves in some cases in group sort of behavior. So they're good at being aggressive to defend against the predators that usually go after them, but they don't have these sort of predators most of the time now. So they can sometimes just be aggressive, as many a child has a dark memory of an aggressive goose They also will have learned to beg for food in some places. One of the famous places in London, there's a pond there where geese have learned to beg for food. And again, in places like that, they don't have any predators, so they'll just be growing a bit out of control. Also, you have all these water spaces, watery and grassy places like golf courses and planned communities that are very attractive spaces to geese. They can also be not so good because when different restoration projects are planting lots of small plants, particularly around wetlands, there's a lot of interest in bringing back plant communities in wetlands. But the geese are ravenous eaters and they can wipe out these plantings. So they can be a bit of a tricky thing. But yeah, I still love geese. The honking and everything, it all, whenever I hear it, it always felt like a change in the seasons and always felt very special. But but if you're getting all of your crops chewed up by geese, that's not going to be so much of a fun time. So that's a little bit of information on Canada geese. And one cool thing that I saw is that geese, a couple of adults will oftentimes look after many goslings, many young geese, and it's called a creche, which isn't a common term in the U.S., but creche in a lot of other places is like a kindergarten. So that's kind of a cute name for adult geese and little baby geese. So that's our animal of the week. Now we're on to our research. This is a pretty short research article, and the research was done by Ki Wion Seo and Dongryo Ryu. This was published in Geophysical Research Letters, and the photo of this will be up on the YouTube if you're just listening to this, if you want to see the author's name's not pronounced horribly. But basically, they were looking at the water levels in the earth. And so this research is around global water and sea level rise. And researchers were looking at the contribution of glaciers and ice caps melting to sea levels. And they were looking at the tilt of the earth on the Earth's axis as a way to get an idea of, or to verify how much has been melting. But they found there was a mismatch, and when they looked a little closer, they found that what fixed this mismatch, what fixed this mismatch was what was I going to say? It was groundwater. So basically, these researchers found that there's been so much groundwater taken out of the ground that this has risen sea levels by about 6 millimeters, which doesn't seem like that much. And it has impacted the tilt of the earth. So they're able to measure how much the earth is tilting. Geophysicists can do this by looking at the axis of the earth and measuring it against distant stars, essentially. So you can sort of look at really distant stars that don't move that much and see how much our axis is moving in relation to that. And they found that the addition of groundwater to the seas has likely impacted the tilt of the axis. And this was some cool research because it is basically a way that you can understand different levels of water that are in the seas by looking at where the axis of the earth has been at. I felt like I described that poorly. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, it's a recurring tradition that the research section is, I tend to make it confusing. I have a habit of making it confusing, and sometimes it doesn't come across as clear. So if you're confused after I describe a research section, it's not your fault. It's always my fault. But the basic summary of this is that the amount of water in our oceans impacts the balance of the earth in space and how it's rotating. And when you take the water from being in the ground to being in the ocean, that is going to have a impact in how the earth is rotating. And when you know how much water has been taken out of the ground and put into the ocean, you can equate that with how much the earth has changed in terms of its tilt. And that is something that can be used to understand groundwater levels of the past. So it is some cool research, but the main message of it is we've taken a lot of water out of the ground, and it's contributed to sea level rise. I'm going to move on before I make it any more confusing. I'm going to see if nope, that's it. Okay, and we're on to the news, and we had a bit of news this week, so strap in. Our first news article this week is that the UN is going to unmask fossil fuel lobbyists at future climate gatherings. So in future, people who are attending climate meetings like the Conference of Parties, which is a big climate meeting that happens possibly every year, it happens frequently. People usually haven't had to disclose what group they're from, but now people are going to have to disclose who they are representing and who they're associated with. In past meetings, there have been more industry representatives, more fossil fuel and gas industry representatives at these climate talks than any one country. But it hasn't been very clear necessarily where people are coming from. And it may seem like, oh, this is kind of a silly thing to do. Like, it's probably pretty obvious where people are from. But in the past, the chair at BP, which is an oil and gas company, has come listed as a delegate of Mauritania, which is a country in Africa. And this can be misleading when you have people who are representing themselves as being delegates from countries that are going to be impacted by climate change. And then if they're lobbying on their behalf saying, oh, we should keep fossil fuels or things like that. Another example of this is that 4 senior members of Total, which is a French oil and gas company, they came as a German environmental group. So they're from Total, but they said they were in a German environmental group, and that all can be very misleading. So this will make people say what industry they are attached to, and will hopefully make things a little bit more clear. And this is before the next UN climate meeting, which is in Dubai, I believe. I don't know exactly where, but the place where the next meeting is going to be is in a country that really relies on oil and gas as their primary energy source. And as we've talked about many times in this podcast before, oil and gas companies have a long history of explicitly attempting to slow and stop changes related to climate change that impacts their industry. So hopefully this will make things more transparent. Our next sort of climate related news is that there was a referendum in Switzerland, and voters voted on this referendum to support cuts to carbon use. This will ideally get Switzerland to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and about 60% of voters supported the bill. So we're seeing more and more that voters are voting in different countries on the national level to support different energy sources. So these are always good news to hear. And Switzerland imports a lot of oil and gas energy. So I'll be curious to see what it is that they do to make up the gap there. But when you have the citizens making this referendum vote to change, then it gives politicians more leeway and more social license to make changes as well. Okay, we have still on the topic of climate change and politics sort of things. We have a possibly big legal challenge in the United Kingdom about fossil fuels. So this legal challenge is about the drilling of new oil wells, and a company has been given access by a council in the UK to drill for oil, and the challenge is saying that this isn't something that should have been approved because of the downstream costs of what the impacts of this gas will be when it's combusted. Because oftentimes in places they are still only accounting for the emissions to set up the project, and they aren't accounting for what the downstream impacts of that combusted energy is going to be. The UK also is committed to, I don't know what their exact commitments are, but they have made big commitments to getting to net zero carbon emissions. So they are legally in a space where they ought not to be necessarily approving these things. And we have a good quote by one of the lead people in this legal challenge. And she said, planning authorities say they don't need to consider the climate impacts of the actual burning of the oil, just from the drilling. It's like saying a chocolate cake is low calorie as long as you don't eat it. So that was a cute little quote. And this is a big deal this one is a big deal in the UK because if it does pass, this will be certainly setting a legal precedent in the UK that would likely prevent similar things from going forward in the future. So that'll be a cool thing to keep an eye on. And the more these sort of changes get enshrined into law, the more cumbersome and expensive it becomes to do fossil fuel extraction, which is more and more tipping the scale towards renewable sources of energy. Renewable energy sources are by no means perfect. There's a lot of issues with mineral extraction and things like that, but there's so much active competition against development of these technologies from oil and gas companies that it makes development that much trickier in those spaces. Okay. And moving right along, we have two more articles left. So nice, speedy, quick eco show this week. But we had a lot going on. But we got through it pretty quickly. Because I didn't get too bogged down in the research this week. I didn't dig myself into too much of a hole, hopefully. Okay, so I've talked about it a few times that there's this high seas ocean treaty, which is essentially setting up rules for the high seas or seas which are not claimed by particular countries. And this treaty it's going through the multiple stages. So it's been getting worked on for the past decade. And then back in March, I believe, they they really tied down the hatches on what it actually is. And just this past week on the 19th of June, I believe they signed the treaty. And there are a few more steps where countries will need to go back and start making changes. But this is a pretty big step because this treaty is legally binding. And some of the big impacts of it are, like we mentioned, the activity that it's regulating is activity that is beyond the jurisdictions of countries. And it will aim to help manage fish stocks so that people are not using too much fish. And also there's an aspect of attempting to control pollution. And so the sort of impacts that polluters are going to be making are going to need to be controlled as well. So the way that this gets implemented by different countries may be varying, but the big aspect of this ocean treaty is the goal to protect 30% of oceans by 2030. And this is a big step towards meeting that goal. And by protecting oceans, you will allow species to regenerate. You'll also have better on-land practices to prevent these sort of pollutants and things like that are going into the seas. There's so much plastic in the ocean. There's thought to be more plastic in the ocean in terms of weight than there are fish in the ocean. So we're at this cool turning point where there's a global consensus that the situation that we are in is not good, and we need to be making changes. And changes are being made in things like this ocean treaty, and in many different ways. But at least for me, when I'm reading the news, I don't get that feeling most of the time. I don't get this feeling that changes are being made that need to be made. Feels like there's a lot of issues going on, and there definitely are a lot of issues going on, but they start to seem a little bit smaller when you have got an eye out for the good things that are happening around the world. So I encourage you to make a habit of either just watching this show because I try to incorporate positive environmental news, or looking up, other things. If you're into rocks, if you're into what's another thing? Celebrities or something like that. You could look up, I think celebrities are a good example of it. Is there's so much, oftentimes the news that you hear about celebrities is usually drama news. That's what tends to sell magazines. But if you're into celebrity news, try just once a week, try Googling or looking for positive celebrity news stories. And once you start to get accustomed to seeing the positive news in an area that you care about, it doesn't make you discount bad things from being real, but it makes you see a little bit of a bigger picture that bad news isn't the only thing that's happening. Because I think oftentimes at least for my mind, it can feel like that. It feels like bad news is the only thing that's happening, or that having sort of having a view of things as being in a overall negative space feels more true. But we're just working with the hand that we got, and we are doing what we can to move things forward, and people are moving things forward. So what's something you care about that you can move things forward on? And our last little news article, just to wrap up the week with some positive news, that's an example that I love about this sort of thing, is that blue whales in California are at 97% of their pre-whaling levels. So blue whales were decreased to very low population levels, and shipping vessels. No, I got ahead of myself a little bit there. Blue whales populations were knocked down a lot, but over time, as they've been protected, their populations have started to come back. And recently, there's a greater understanding of the impact that shipping vessels have on striking marine animals, particularly in California. You have a lot of shipments going on. So shipping vessels changed their lanes and also lowered their speeds, and there were much less incidents of whale strike. And when they were looking at rates of whale strike, they were monitoring populations of whales and found that these blue whales are at 97% of their pre-whaling levels. So I imagine at one point, when you look historically at the history of whales, they were at a point that seemed catastrophic, and it probably seemed as though they were going to go extinct, but they're coming back and flowing through the water now. So a good little bit of news for the end of this week. And that's about it for this week. So I hope you all have had a good one. Hope the news was interesting, and we'll catch you all next time. Bye bye.